Welcome to Common Language, a series of digital events produced by Poet in the City that pairs poets with activists and academics to unpack those everyday words used in the news cycle. Today's subject is safe housing. My name is Ellen Moran. I am a poet, an activist, a community organiser living in Northumberland. And today I'm talking to textile artist and housing activist Ghazal Haqani. Ghazal, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, Ellen. My name is Ghazal Haqani, and I'm a textile artist and housing activist with London Renters Union. And I work closely with communities in Newham.
Brilliant. So before we kick things off, I'd like to get us started and open the conversation with a poem. And this poem is a spoken word piece, which is very personal to me. It's about my great auntie. It's a true story. And it's called Peggy. The slums of Shieldfield and Sandyford still stood in the 60s, only just holding on at the cobbled post-war city's industrial hill, looking down at the Tyne, at shipyards and manufacture in steady decline. For years it was said that they had to go. For too long had this rabble formed a smoked black tableau of buildings, of coal, of dirty children destined for the dole. So just before the relinquished control, the government plans were set in motion. A well thought out political potion to cure the ills of northern cities, private subcontracted architects, I am still talking about the 60s, were asked to stack the poor on top of one another. Father, brother, sister, mother in sky buildings of concrete and glass. A way to rid the landscape of the miners and the builders, the working class. Peggy Nary's boarding house stood at the Sandyford end. No children of her own, but a confidant and a friend. Softly spoken, if she had a room to spare, she'd lend a bed or an ear to those in despair. When the council announced their plan for demolition, people around her left of their own volition to other shanty towns or prefabs up in Benwell. But Peggy wouldn't move, and neither would her personal hotel. But Peggy, who wants waterlogged bonker-shaped rubble? It's not like you to be causing trouble. Nah, man. Give us cobble and brick. Need plastic, paper walls that won't withstand the next war. I've lived here all my life and I'm not leaving unless they give us something more. So she told the council she would not move henceforth. A couple of days later, my granddad's got the telly on. Yeah, Jean, Peggy's on Look North. And there she was, refusing to move, somewhere between a businesswoman and an activist. The sole protagonist, the council's key antagonist. I wonder what she cared about more, the boarding house or the social cleansing. I wonder if she could fully comprehend the evil that she was contending, because it's 50 years later and it feels like now it's changed. People sleeping on the streets while student flats lie empty, Tory housing policy still deranged. And those sky buildings, they built back then in Peggy's backyard, now they get coated in polyethylene and end up charred, filled with the bodies of the vulnerable and the unaccounted for, the people the press simultaneously mourn for and abhor. How it was being Irish back then, it's the same for being brown now. This unending discrimination we cannot continue to allow. But at least Peggy made a stand. And you know what? They moved to Jesmond and gave her land. And Peggy, if you can hear me, our priorities are so different. I'm more concerned with ending eviction and universal credit, but the sheer rageness of your gentle protest has filled my heart inside my chest. but ever Geordie lasses say it best. How our Newcastle City Council sling your hook or give it a rest.
That's lovely. That was so powerful as well. And
Thank
it's
you.
it's such a spoken thing for it to make an effect, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely a piece of spoken word, and it relies very heavily on the dialect to create the characters and stuff. So I hope you can understand it.
Most of it, yes, I would say, yes, definitely. I found it very powerful.
Great. What sort of things did that open up for you? What kind of things resonated, or what questions did it raise?
So firstly, when you say about what was Irish back then is what is brown, what it is to be brown now. And that directly speaks to me as who are the outsiders now. And with my work with London Renters Union, and we focus mainly on the London city, and the people on the fringes are definitely not always, obviously, but it does affect the Black and brown ethnic minorities most.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I've always felt that unless it is us who start leading some of these struggles, it won't really, have that impact.
Mm,
So,
absolutely.
so we are doing that. I mean, a lot of our work is about empowering communities, having them see that they are powerful, and how they can win.
And
And they
how
are
do you
winning.
do that? Yeah, how do you do that? How do you, what's your approach? What's your method to empowering those communities?
So I think so. One of the first things is building that sense of solidarity,
Mm-hmm.
um, because we live in such transient communities where we don't know the neighbor. We don't know who the people around us are. We're very, very sort of reluctant to uh, speak to them and inquire how they are. So what we do, and what we have successfully done in the last few years, is um, try and build those spaces where people can come together and speak without feeling that shame, because that shame isn't theirs. It is a community, it is a communal, it is a social failure if a basic necessity as housing is not there, is not safe enough for people. So that sense of shame is very powerful, and then to be able to speak and own, um, own the problem,
Mm.
is a big deal. So that is where we start with, and then trainings about tenant rights have been very important, and training around eviction has been very important in the uh, last year or so during the pandemic. Um, and again, direct action has been something that we have constantly not shied away from, and we have won. So there have been several wins in the last few months where we have got councils to comply, where we have got people to assert
Mm-hmm.
their rights, got landlords, to see what they need to do and not.
Yeah, and direct action just puts that pressure on to show someone who thinks they have all of the power, like a landlord or social housing provider, that there's a group of people who disagree with them, and that the power is actually with the greatest number of people. essentially, at the end of the day. And it's to put that pressure on and say, well, you know, we're not going to let you get away with that.
Absolutely.
And that can be the turning point for a lot of people, because they do things because they know they can get away with it and it makes them money, essentially.
Yes, yes, and that is again something I found very inspiring in your poem, how Peggy stood up to this, almost like a David and Goliath kind of a thing that it comes across as. But that is just so important. And one
Yeah,
of
that's it, right? So she was on her own though, and that's the difference, right? Because I think the sort of working class, low income people when you look at the history of the UK, have been really disempowered, and people have, like, throughout the 20th century, like, people have had things done to them, and there's a rich history of people coming together to fight that, of course, as well. But I think it's really important to remember that sometimes just being that one person who stands up can make a change in your neighbors as
yes,
well.
yes,
Obviously, yeah, that's exactly what you're doing, and that solidarity that you're looking for as well.
absolutely, yes. And sometimes just to be able to speak that which other people are thinking.
Yeah.
And that takes courage, but that makes such a big difference.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about the evictions that you were talking about, and I know that there was supposedly a short-term ban on evictions throughout the pandemic that was lifted, and that the rights that landlords have to evict tenants are ridiculously too many. Tell me about what sort of work LRU has done with people who have been facing eviction.
So, Section 21 was something that the previous government has been talking about, and during the elections, the Conservative government campaigned on it. They said that they're going to remove Section 21. Fast forward to the pandemic, when that was really needed, they did not do it, and even now they've sort of they have delayed it. They do have no intention of canceling Section 21, which is a no-cause eviction where the landlord can just say leave and give a few months notice for that, and they have to and people have to leave. So in the last during the pandemic, what had happened was that landlords did not really think it was necessary to go through the court proceedings, and they would ask tenants to leave, and they sometimes force people out. So we have had lots of we have conducted trainings for people to know their rights and that they don't really have to leave. And especially when you are a migrant, you don't really know always what are the rights around in your tenancy. So it becomes really important, but we have also had to have direct action at times where we have stopped evictions from happening. And what is sad sometimes is, or very often, is that the police side with the landlord, even though they are in the wrong.
Yeah, and those eviction resistances take a lot of courage and a lot of strength between neighbors to come together to stop someone removing someone from a home. And you know, in my experience of those things as well, like, the police just don't know at all what tenants' rights are. They aren't trained on it. They are completely ignorant, and so they side with the person who they think has the most power.
Exactly.
It's
Yes.
a kind of unconscious thing almost. They don't really think about it.
Yeah, but I wouldn't like to give them as an excuse, because it is, after all, their duty to learn about these things, especially when they're working in the community. And I mean, when we look at the history of the police in this country, it is mainly to protect the wealth of the wealthy and the wealthy. So it comes quite naturally that they do that.
That's exactly it. That's the sort of mechanism of the state that's set up to protect the interests of the rich and to keep them powerful. So are there any other sort of issues within the private rental sector that you've been looking at recently? I mean, I know evictions probably one of the biggest ones, but when I worked as a community organizer, I met a lot of people who were facing unsanitary and dangerous conditions. Could you tell me a little bit about what it's like where you are in London and what the state of the housing stock is like?
So, so I'm based in Newham in London, and that is statistically one of the poorest, one of the most deprived boroughs. And it is no coincidence that about 40% of the people who live here were not born in this country. And a big population also do not have English as the first language, which is again a huge barrier and a debilitating factor. So the social housing and private rented accommodation, these two sectors are quite closely linked, because what the governments, both the governments, what they have done in the past few decades is they have sold off the council stock, and that has directly led to a rise in private rented accommodation. But what has happened, and it's starting to be spoken about now, is that these were the houses that the landlords have bought and converted them into low quality private accommodation, where they don't often look at the repairs. There is awful damp, and people are forced to live in extremely squalid conditions. Now, Newham has a policy of licensing, and so houses have to be licensed by the council so that the landlords can rent them. But the prosecution rate is so low. In fact, through freedom of information request, we were able to find out that in the last several years, there has been no prosecution. So it is virtually useless. The landlords still have a bigger say, and they get away with a lot. And for the most basic sort of repairs, tenants have to go through a very long-winded procedure where they are again asked to go from pillar to post.
Yeah.
Temporary accommodation is another huge scandal, which where the council gives people this accommodation, but it's usually not temporary, and the tenants have very few rights, and they are yes, they're usually overcrowded. Sorry.
Yeah, and that's a major issue for asylum seekers and refugees in this country, isn't it? That they're moved around various temporary accommodations and have completely like the worst level of hygiene and safety within the properties as well. Like again, so it relates to what we talked about right at the start of this. So we were talking about the most marginalized people in societies, Black and brown communities, people who have come to this country looking for help and are put into positions where they're just not safe. And it's always the same story, isn't it? And yeah, what you were saying there about licensed properties, and also the way that the social housing stock has been moved into private hands. And that's something that began in the 1980s, and Margaret Thatcher introduced the right to buy, which allowed people to save up to buy their properties and then moved into the private sector. Now, of course, they haven't built any new social housing. And now one of the things that I hate is affordable housing, because that's been replaced with affordable housing. Affordable is not affordable at all. You know, you talk about £200,000 properties being classed as affordable. Yeah. So like these are all of the policies and decisions that have gone into producing the housing crisis in this country. And it really, for me, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it. For me, it kind of comes down to the fact that being a landlord is a highly sought after job nowadays. Now, I'm interested if you have the same issue as me, Ghazal, because on my algorithm on Facebook or Instagram, they know that I'm interested in housing. They know that I'm working around housing, right? So I get all these adverts of how to be a great landlord.
Yes.
Do you get that too?
A lot, yes. And that is so funny. But I also end up reading a lot of the comments, and it can be quite heartening sometimes, that, people saying this is awful. So that is a good thing. But yes, it's crazy how they target me.
And I guess
because
that
I'm interested in housing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just a mistake of the algorithm ultimately, but those programs and getting an insight into that world, it's exactly what you would imagine, isn't it? It's all about making money. These people, they don't care at all about their tenants most of the time, but the landlord lobby is full of phrases like "not all landlords," and they're winning. They have a lot of power and a lot of control and sway over local councils and over central government as well.
Well, I mean, it's useful to see the number of MPs who are landlords themselves.
Exactly.
So they're not going to really create any laws against themselves. And the idea of landlordism itself is quite problematic, and it's difficult sometimes to even speak to very rational friends who are very sort of sensible and very aware in many ways, but they don't really see a problem with being a landlord. And you really have to break it down to, would that be okay if you were, or if people were allowed to hoard food? And how is it okay, and that would be criminal if you were allowed to do that, and then sell it in small quantities at a very high price. But it is completely acceptable when it comes to food, which is also a basic human need. So how is that? How does that work? And there is really no awareness, and that it's so important for the narrative to shift.
Yeah, and yet instead, what we're seeing is is a very successful landlord industry, in which people who have a small amount of money to invest are, playing the housing market as if it was stocks and shares, essentially, and coming in, investing in property, doing the bare minimum work and repairs. They're not managing the properties themselves as well, because of course we have letting agents to do that for them very poorly, and they're the middlemen who get a nice chunky cut as well. And have you had any experience with letting agents? And I know they're a fine breed of people.
One of the things that we constantly get into is how openly and how with impunity, they can say that people with housing benefits are not allowed.
Yeah.
So, and that is sometimes written on their shop windows, and that is obviously to attract landlords. But again, all of this is bound to happen when you see housing as a commodity, as a market commodity. And then it's just a downward spiral. What we have managed to do, and that was one of our first wins, is we campaigned against the NatWest Bank, which had in their mortgage contract a clause which prohibited landlords from letting their properties to people who claimed housing benefits. And we successfully got them to remove that clause.
On the streets outside NatWest
That's right.
in Newcastle, yeah.
Yes. Oh,
On the
you've
day
done
of
that.
action. Yeah, I was part of that.
Brilliant.
And also the Santander, and there was Lloyd's as well, had a similar mortgage contract clause, I think, Lloyd's Bank. And
yes.
I know that renters unions across the country came together to sort that out as well.
Yes.
Or, do as much as we could. Yeah. So obviously, I think we're both coming at the issues from a place where we want to bring as many people together as possible and do joined up collective action.
Yes.
How does this relate to your work as a textile artist, and what kind of things are you starting to think about bringing in terms of using your art to help people with this as well?
To be very honest with you, this is something that I am still exploring. But what I do at the moment is I use my art as a way to avoid the burnout that does happen, that sense of hopelessness that, oh God, this is like a huge mountain. Nobody seems to understand your language almost. There are days like that. But what I've also tried to do, and has happened to an extent, is bring people from different sections of the community together to allow a sort of dialogue to happen in a very non-pressured way, where they're not challenged directly, but those exchanges can then lead to a greater understanding of how the other side lives. Because where I live, there are just, and I think lots of places in London, of course, there are pockets, isn't it, pockets of deprived communities, and pockets where they are pretty well off. You wouldn't think that they're neighbors, and they barely ever cross roads. They don't really interact much. So bringing them together has been quite inspiring, and sometimes led to very powerful conversations.
Yeah, and I think as well, like in London especially, it's been really important for poets to speak out to their neighbours. When you look at Grenfell and the area where the Grenfell Tower tragedy took place, incredibly wealthy people living just next door. Yeah. And being able to get out on the streets and speak on and come together and speak on these issues has been really important. And I know that there's been a lot of poetry that's come out of that as well. People like Jada David, I know of, who have spoken out about in a very intersectional way about housing, and using the Grenfell tragedy as a sort of locus for that has been a major thing in London. That's what I'm seeing anyway.
Yes, yeah. I've heard Loki, who has also, whose words are very, very powerful. Yes. What do you think, though, about people who are not directly affected by the housing issue? How do you have you had any success in bringing them together?
Yes and no. I think that the people who are involved in the fight are the people who are essentially being persecuted. Every so often, you hear of homeowners or people who are sympathetic joining the movement. And of course, there's immense solidarity in the north of England between white working class people and asylum seekers and refugees as well, coming together to kind of help each other in their individual fights, and make it less individual and join the dots kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Having that class solidarity is just so important. Where they're coming together, where people are coming together because of the common struggle, and then those sort of the other identities sort of melt away, and it almost becomes a powerful powerful movement.
Humans.
Yes. But what I can say about London Renters Union is that there have been lots of people who are homeowners, but who are also there as, showing solidarity and being there in solidarity. So but also it has been really important, and what we have constantly done is to center the voice of people who have the lived experience, and that is what generates that energy, really.
I think you're doing an incredible job in that, and well done. We're going to wrap things up now. Thank you so much for joining me, Ghazal. It's been an incredible conversation, and yeah, we've obviously got
Thank you.
a lot in common. And thank you to everyone for tuning into Common Language. Be sure to sign up to Poet in the City's mailing list via the website to stay up to date with when the next episode is going to be. I've been Ellen Moran, speaking to Ghazal Haqani about safe housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.